So tell me, Jason, what makes a city great to live in for you?
For me, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just having everything accessible and everything kind of available within walking distance or a very short Uber. Um,
Right. And
so
also inexpensive Uber.
inexpensive Uber, although it's probably getting a little bit like I think inflation is really hitting the Uber industry. Like I've noticed that it's a little bit more expensive to get around. But I like having so something that's always been very top of mind in choosing a place to live is that my commute has to be as short as possible. One of the best times of my life was living like 2 minutes walk from my work, and that meant that I was able to interact with the city. So I was able to go to bars, go to like meetups, have access to all of these different uh, opportunities to interact with other people. But also, when you go to work, you don't have to do this like long commute, and
Mm.
you basically get to experience the city, and you're not spending hours just going backwards and forwards to your home.
So research actually shows that the distance of your commute is directly proportional to the rates of depression in that area, which I think is fairly fascinating. And I get it, is that when you're on that commute, when you're traveling, especially in traffic, in a car, first thing in the morning, last thing in the afternoon, it's a stressful experience. And if you're doing that for, 45 minutes to an hour each day, that's, you know, a 10% of your entire day that you're spending in a state of like heightened stress and awareness. Is that, sure, you can have chill drives if you live somewhere nice, but most of the time you're driving into the city, you're stuck in traffic, there's taxis, there's, the smell of exhaust, there's the honking of horns, and that's a pretty high stress situation. I think your body over that entire duration is just releasing so much cortisol that of course it's going to fuck with you.
Exactly. So for me, I used to well, I come from Somerset West, which is about 30 minutes outside of Cape Town. And what really cinched it for me is a couple of times I decided that it would be a good idea to stay in Somerset West and go to an exam that I had at university on a Monday or Tuesday morning. Um, so I would so there was either two ways that this would go. If I got up too late, I would have to sit in that traffic, and so my car wasn't. I mean, my car was pretty reliable, but there were times throughout that car's lifetime that the battery wasn't the greatest. So sometimes it would cut out if you weren't driving it. So you can imagine like driving through the traffic, you're going towards an exam or some sort of class that you have in the morning, and there's this addition of the fact that your car might break down while you're on the N2 between like Baden Powell and the airport, which is like
Yeah.
for most people who don't live in Cape Town, that's a pretty dodgy area to break down.
Oh, it's
So,
awful.
so to avoid that, what you would do is you would get up a few hours earlier, like 4 a.m. You would drive into the city, drive into wherever my exam was, and then I would sit there and I would have like a power nap or I'd like revise in my car inside the parking lot just so that I wouldn't have to, so I wouldn't be late for my class, but I also wouldn't have to sit in traffic. And for work, I also did that a couple of times when I first started my job in the city. So,
Yeah. So one question with that is, so you've got that stress of trying to get to the place that you're going to on time, right? And so you're getting there like really early. Do you think that that affected your ability to actually revise as well?
so getting there early meant that I mean, if I wasn't very good with like getting good night's sleep and all of that. I was still in this mentality that I was like a night person. So I just put it down to that I'm not good at mornings, but it did it did give me a little bit less anxiety because it was like, okay, at least I'm here, and a lot of my when I'm trying to get somewhere on time, I prefer to get there on time a little bit early and then just chill around the area. And that kind of alleviated a bit of that stress for sure. Um, but again, if I was sleep deprived or a little bit tired because I woke up, there may be a
Mm.
canceling effect to that too.
So I think so. To add to that is, I think that absolutely, the thing that makes a city that has one of the biggest impacts on a city being livable and quote unquote happy is definitely the ability to get around easily, preferably walking and cycling. So improved like cycle infrastructure is always great. Um, but one of the things, so I'm currently reading the book Happy City by Charles Montgomery, and for you've read this book previously,
Yeah.
and you and I have had quite a few chats about it, and it's a very affirming book. It's something that we all kind of implicitly know. Just put in words, like if you are in a city that is pretty, right, and that is delightful to be in, to spend time in green spaces, in parks, social cohesion, less traffic that can over, preferably less air and noise pollution, is you live a happier life overall, or live a life that is uh, easier and nicer than if you're commuting, if you're hearing the sound of traffic the entire time, which again research has shown that noise pollution has a huge adverse effect on our mental health. um, but I like to compare uh, what makes a good city to something that most of us are already familiar with, and that is being in university, right? Is that being in university is such an enjoyable period of time for so many people, um, for the reason that university towns or university campuses are human centric, right? You walk or cycle everywhere. The residences tend to be very close to where you will go to study, to socialize, to work, to etc. 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 So as soon as you step foot onto campus, you don't have to worry about traffic running you over. You don't. There isn't much noise pollution. You can go to a restaurant or a bar to socialize with your friends. You can chill on the lawn and set up a slackline or play hacky sack. Um, you can go to the library to study. You will bump into people who you know on campus. So there's this high social cohesion. And what also is the case with universities is that you tend to share a socioeconomic background with people around you, which is debatably good or not, depending
Yeah.
on which what you're supporting over here. Um, and so, if we can create cities that are similar to university campuses, those cities tend to be very lovely to live in. We can see that in places like the Netherlands or in parts of uh, Nordic countries where the public transport and cycle and walking infrastructure are great, and there are all these social places to get together and spend time chatting. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think I definitely agree with that social cohesion. So first of all, on the like having control of your own destiny, I think for everyone that's amazing. Like being able to walk to work. If someone like bumps like comes across your path, you can kind of dodge them. You can walk along the pavement pretty fine. You're not gonna like have someone swerve or like potentially kill you. So that's a great thing to be in, where your mind is basically in control of your body getting to work. Then
Mm,
the people aspect I think is super critical, because I feel like if you're living in the suburbs, you basically get your perception of the world through the media, um, and
oh, that's
through
interesting.
other people's perceptions of the world. So this is like one of my theses recently, is that people who live in the suburbs who think the country is like going to the dogs, or they want to leave and all of that. My thesis is that they should go live in the city for a bit, walk the city, like go to places where people like group, and realize that things aren't as bad. Okay, they're bad, but there are like pockets of greatness that are happening. But without those, you're basically stuck uh, in your suburban house, listening to the news. The news isn't always positive. In fact, it's hardly ever positive, and you just get this really bad perception of what's going
Mm.
on.
So it also depends on what city you're talking about. Is that Cape Town has got like a really nice walking center. You know,
Yeah.
you can walk around the city center. You can walk through Greenpoint, Sea Point. Um, Woodstock is technically also walkable, and there is a bit of social cohesion over there between the people who live there. But it does get a bit dangerous.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe
but
as I think the thing is also being male is also a little bit easier for us. I don't know if girls have, or anyone else has the same kind of sense of security. Like I can
yeah,
imagine it not being the same.
yeah,
But
I hear you.
I do agree.
So I recently spent time in Chicago, and Chicago has got a lot of very interesting things about it, but it is very much a car-centric city, right? And a lot of American cities are very car-centric, which means that you are essentially just like living in an extended suburb. Chicago is also referred to as just like the city of neighborhoods, right?
Mm,
And so sprawl sucks because you don't necessarily know the people who you live around. Um, and you go from your car into your house and then from your house into
mm,
your car and you drive through to your place of work or whatever. And I think that Johannesburg has that same issue. Um, since I've been here in the States, and I'm coming home soon, but since I've been here in the States, I've been spending a lot of time in these these little towns up in the Rocky Mountains,
mm,
and they've got all of these aspects that make um, cohesive living good. Right, a very walkable town. You can walk from one end to the other, over half an hour. There are lots of green places and parks. Like I've spent so much time just like finding a tree in a park and just reading under it for a while. And other people who I know in the town will just like happen to walk past you in the park and then come and have a chat with you. Someone will set up a Slack line. And um, just last week, I had met some people in Salida who I was staying with, and we went to the park to eat a sandwich. And another friend who we hadn't seen in a few weeks just came wandering along and came and joined us. And then someone who we played D&D with, a an artist, he was chatting with another group of friends down in the corner, and so
mm.
these groups combined, and we're all just sitting in this riverside park having an absolutely lovely accidental afternoon. And I think that is so fundamental to a again quote unquote happy place to live.
Mm.
I don't necessarily like the term happy, but just like an ideal place to live
Mm.
is
But
that there is this social cohesion through architectural and urban design.
yeah, so that's the kind of stuff that like gets me jonesing a bit. It's like the architectural part. Like I've always had like this fascination with architecture, and for me, like city design is such an interesting kind of you know thing to do for your life. Is you kind of work out how big a certain courtyard needs to be to make it the perfect size to have enough social interaction, but also have places where people can go and like be themselves and have these smaller gatherings. Uh, it's really like such a fascinating kind of career, and I really like that that specific book. I mean, it must be amazing to be in America to be able to actually like see firsthand like that happening. And I think that was for me. I went to Texas. I went to Dallas, which I feel is sprawl, and then I went to Seattle, which I would say is probably not. But I mean, I didn't go too much into the suburbs there, so it's kind of you can see it in reality that there's this design around cars, um, but it's also it's not just the city. I do believe there is a sense of place. I
Hmm.
think with Cape Town, it's great because you've got that big old mountain that's like just ripe for climbing. or for
It's so
going
accessible as
hiking,
well.
and so accessible. I think some of the cities, maybe Johannesburg, where they maybe don't have so much green space or they don't have like much of that activity, you kind of have to make up for it in other ways. But I
Mm.
really, from a Cape Town point of view, is you've got the architecture is all right. We've got a few new buildings. We've got pretty walkable streets, I'd say. But being able to have that access to nature is also super important. Whether it's driving outside the city to get to that nature, or whether it's in the city, that is like critical, I think.
Yeah. So, as you know, I was also recently in New York, and New York is very like walk centric, right? You walk, you take the subways, you hop on your bicycle, and sure, there is a lot of traffic on the streets, but um, it kind of feels that pedestrians were very much catered to. Um, and the green space for them is, Central Park, which is
Mm.
massive. I didn't realize just how big it was,
Yeah,
but
but that's also
um,
because of necessity, right? It's the same in London. Like they've got such a high density of people. Like you literally can't have cars in there. Like it would just be
yeah.
a nightmare.
So I was recently in Boulder, Colorado. So Boulder and Denver are half an hour, 45 minutes away from one another, and both of these are uh, cities. So Denver's bigger than Boulder, um, and they have large sidewalks. They have a lot of like pedestrian and cycle accommodation. And I think the stereotypical Coloradian is he's riding his mountain bike with his dog, and then he bumps into his friend on the street, and they go to the bar and they get an IPA, right? Because everyone's just drinking IPAs here, left, right, and center. Um, and so there is a distinct correlation between the walkability of a city and the rates of obesity in that city, right? And one of the things that anecdotally I've definitely seen around Colorado is that people tend to be in much better shape than people who I saw in, say, Baltimore, or the Baltimore suburbs, or uh, Chicago for that matter. And it kind of makes sense, is just having that individual mobility. The fact of the matter is, to stay at least reasonably healthy, it just takes, a bit of walking every day. And if I take a look at my iPhone's pedometer, is when I was staying in Pasadena, just outside of Baltimore, so in not a suburb but an exurb,
Mm.
so one step further than a suburb, is I barely walked um, like 2,000 steps a day. I Because there wasn't anywhere to walk to. Like I could explicitly go and take a walk around the block, but that would mean that I was taking a walk explicitly to take a walk. Whereas when I was in New York or when I was in Denver, is I would take a look at my pedometer and I had, exceeded 10, 15,000 steps for that day, just because I'm like, oh, I want to go to that restaurant down there, and I'll walk to it because that is one of the ways to do it. Although I must say that those like little Lime scooters that we spoke about on our previous or two episodes ago, um, definitely cut down on that time if you feel like it.
They convenient
Um,
and they fun. Like I think,
yep,
isn't it like such a great thing to do? Like I mean,
it's
I
so
used to
good.
have a push scooter for a while. I mean, I was more of a bicycle person, but I did have a push scooter at one point. And there's nothing like more fun than just scootering around. And now you've just taken this electric battery and just stuck it on your scooter. It's so fun just to get around town. Like you basically just zooting through
Yeah,
the city. Um,
and so they're all
yeah,
capped at 20 miles per hour, which is still crazy fast.
yeah, exactly. It's like a fun way to get around, and that kind of breaks a little bit of the monotony. Gives you that little bit of a boost to your way of life, and it's kind of just a fun thing to do. And I think fun plays a part in it, and being able to have uh, you know access to these green spaces. But I think
Hmm.
the one thing that is maybe something that we don't have experience about is the fact that there's people who have kids and who are family people, And I've recently heard this term empty nester, which is what we are. Uh, for us, it's maybe a little bit easier, and also, I guess, depending
Hold
on
on,
how much.
let me clarify over that. I've always assumed that the term empty nester was after like you had kids and then they left home.
I mean, I feel like some people have been using it as a term to define people who don't have kids, but it could
No,
be
that's fair.
both. Um, I mean, if you have an empty nest, is it? It could be both. But
Great.
anyway, so the this is like one of those things that also depends on what kind of jobs you can get. Because I mean, living in the city, it's pretty pricey, and where that comes from is whether it's like, is it because most of the places are buy and rent by people who don't actually live in the city? Is it
Hmm.
Airbnbs that are pushing up the prices of housing in the cities? I mean, I know in Cape Town, one of the quite interesting things is that during the apartheid, like they kind of made the city as a place for business, and
Hmm.
everyone would live in the suburbs and commute in, and that's how the city was designed. So you'll notice if you walk around Cape Town, there's not a lot of residential buildings within the CBD, and that was because South Africans preferred to have like a nice house where they lived and then just drive into the city, but that's caused problems now because everyone now works in the city and they all have to get through that uh, one little road, and probably the busiest intersection in the whole of South Africa. So it has some knock-on effects, but they are starting to build more residential buildings inside of the city. So if
Hmm.
you're working for one of the big banks or you're working for like some of the accounting firms, you don't have to commute so far. But again, that's not always going to be the right choice for people who have kids.
Yeah, I hear you. And so what you bring up over there is actually super important. Is that um, most cities were designed with industry in mind and not designed as human-centric cities. There are a couple of places. There's a couple of cities that have gone up in Korea that are explicitly human-centrically designed, and they're very, very modern cities. I think the music video for Gangnam Style was filmed in one of those cities, and you can see that it looks like a park, right? It's just like a big park, but with these big buildings spotted here and there inside of that park. So you would essentially walk between buildings, between restaurants through this park, and then all of the roads and parking infrastructure and all of that is actually underneath this park or
Hmm.
underneath the buildings, which I think is really fascinating because it cuts down on the noise and the traffic and the air pollution. Well, all of that is just tucked underground. Um, but that brings another interesting tangent over there is that when it comes to uh, roads specifically, is that historically, as recently as like 100 years ago, the road was a shared space, right? Everyone would walk on the road, sell stuff on the road. I mean, we think of roads now as explicitly places where cars go, but no, like thoroughfares where people would stand and gather, and it would also be used for you to walk from or cycle from one side to the other. And then when motor cars started becoming a thing, uh, they were kind of like hated by everyone who lived in these places because they started making this shared space quite unsafe, and many people were starting to, you know, die in these motor vehicle accidents, predominantly pedestrians and predominantly children. Um, and so that's when there was this big push towards making sure that all people stay on the sidewalks and all cars are on the road, and then at specific points people then have permission to use the roads in terms of like crosswalks or stuff like that. And that's where the term jaywalker was actually coined. Is that it's a derogatory term, a jay, and that was
Hmm.
essentially like put into official legislation to kind of shame people from walking in the street. Um, but then you've seen cities like turn that around entirely. So if you take a look, and I definitely recommend you do this, Google pictures of Amsterdam uh, back in the 40s or 50s, and it will look like a lot of what Cape Town looks like currently, right? There are way too many cars, and they are parked all the way up and down the sides of the streets. Um, and there was just like way too many cars, and the streets were not shared places. And it looked quite dingy, and it looked like it smelled like exhaust, especially considering this was the 40s and 50s before catalytic converters were really
Yeah.
a thing.
Yeah.
Um, and if you take a look at Amsterdam today, all of the streets in central Amsterdam are walking streets with electric trams that run through and incredible cycling infrastructure. And it is an absolute pleasure to be in there.
Mm.
That was due to many regulatory steps by the Dutch government to turn this into a human-centric place. So it is possible to take something that was built for industry, at least in Amsterdam's place, it was like industry, for the past couple hundred years, whereas in Cape Town, less, more recent.
Yeah.
Um, but it is entirely possible to take a city that is difficult to live in and turn it into a place that is absolutely delightful.
Mm. But it does require a lot of input, and you have to have forethought about what's going to happen in the future. And I think maybe in South Africa we don't necessarily have the tax base, and I guess we have other things to think about, like power supply and all of that. But it's actually interesting you mentioned the like human centric part. Is like I've walked around the Barbican in London, and you will actually see these kind of like raised walkways that they've
Mm,
created, because back in those times they thought, the car is definitely the future. So let's let the cars, drive around, and let's put everyone who needs to walk on these like elevated walkways. There's a couple of kind of shows on YouTube you can check where people have kind of documented these walkways that go to nowhere, or they like go throughout the city. And that was like an attempt to kind of get people outside of the way of cars, because there was obviously people getting hit by cars all the time. Obviously, like, I mean, you had to go up a flight of steps to even get onto these rampways. So, it's obviously a failed experiment, and, people didn't really want to use them. So it's kind of one of those things where they kind of thought that was going to be the future. They built
hmm
these things, and obviously people, didn't want to do it because it wasn't a true human centric thing, because they put that car at the center.
Yeah, I hear
Obviously,
you, and
their
I
idea
think that
was
that's.
the idea was like the car is the future. Everyone should have a car, and it's the same in the US. It's like that's what they were thinking, and I mean, in that book, there's a little bit of a sort of dip into the kind of marketing side of the auto industry, which I mean, that's also very interesting to know about. That there was definitely a push about, uh, you know, to be an American, you have to be independent, and independent is having a car. Um, so that pushed a lot of people to buy cars. Then on the Amsterdam story, I think the first thing is just getting people to go and I think for South Africans it's really hard. Well, from like people in the middle class, it's hard to like go to work in a bus because there's so much unreliability in it, and also just the factor of you got to be in a bus with all these other people that you don't know. And I think that's part of you need to have appreciation that there are other people in the city, and you have to be kind of used to interacting with different people before
hmm
you're gonna get on a bus and go to work in what is kind of. I mean, I've taken the train from Somerset West to Cape Town station. It's not the most fun on a morning. You basically sardined into this train with a whole bunch of other people around you. Everyone's kind of coughing and sweating on you, and it's not a great experience.
So if we were to make some ideal upgrades to Cape Town, now keep in mind that Cape Town is a city where the vast majority of its wealth comes from the tourism industry. So I would argue that it would be in the Cape Town government's financial best interest to actually improve the walkability and just overall like happiness of the city itself. And uh, I would arguably say that Cape Town is the perfect city for a tourist to visit if it weren't for crime and personal safety. Is that is the one issue that we do have. We've got incredible access to nature, and the city is a lot of fun, but we do also have a fairly high crime rate due to multiple factors, income inequality, et cetera, et cetera. So here are my proposed upgrades to Cape Town.
Well,
We
firstly, before you go into that, I just want to
Yeah.
say that it's also there's this difference between who's developing the project, and I think it's also important that while I think Cape Town, I'm sure they do have a regional planning division or a city planning office. They should be thinking about these things that are expressed in books like Happy City, and I'm sure there are people who are doing that because a lot of the buildings are private buildings. Like if you think of the waterfront, there's this private element of like this is a business. This is like if you look at Portside, it's like this big glass building, and it's obviously a bank, money, But that building, if you go to street level, I mean, it's not the greatest kind of footprint on the ground. So, how do you like enforce a certain way of building your city where most of the money is actually just private people and they probably have their influences? I know Harbour Arch, which is pretty similar to Melrose Arch in Johannesburg, is being built at the moment, just within the foreshore area. And I've heard some stories that it maybe isn't going to be as human centric. Maybe once you're in Harbour Arch, it'll be very human centric. But would you be able to connect to other parts of the city very easily, or would you have to get into your car and then drive to the waterfront and then you walk around the waterfront, and you get into kind of this like bigger version of commuting between different buildings.
Well, so I share some worries about that developments happening at the moment. But I think the waterfront is actually a very good example of something that is quite human centric and walkable. Right? You've got those drawbridges. You can walk between different areas. You can walk from like the Zeitz through to the V&A Wharf. You can walk along the canals, which are all like completely walkable only. There aren't any roads.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's absolutely delightful. And when we talk about like what power the government has, or the municipal government has over the design of a city, is that they might not necessarily be able to influence the way that businesses build their buildings. Or I mean, they could, but what they can certainly do is they can change the infrastructure that surrounds it.
Mm.
So we've got a couple of streets in Cape Town that make up the sort of like entertainment and nightlife section of the city, and that's like Bree Street, Loop Street, Long Street, and these streets are generally like pumping with people,
Also,
especially in the
Kloof.
evenings. Yeah, and Kloof Street. I mean, that's just an extension of Long Street. Let's be completely
Yeah,
honest.
but it's definitely coming up. It's coming up in the times. Like I used to walk past and down that street pretty much every day at my previous job, and it's definitely grown a lot.
Yeah,
But go on,
absolutely,
go on.
absolutely. But yeah, so with those three streets, is I would I would be a very firm proponent to turn all of those into purely walk and cycle only streets. Maybe with an electric tram that runs from the base of Long Street up to the top of Kloof Street and back down again in a vernacular um, fashion, right? And then have a parking structure at the bottom and at the bottom of Long Street. So if you work at a business in Long Street and you do commute into the city, you can park in that parking structure, and then you can walk through those city streets or hop on the tram, and then this turns this area into a very very centric area. Um, but it also means that uh, there would have to be an increase in sort of public awareness and safety infrastructure. And currently, we're doing a pretty alright job over there. Um, it's still not entirely safe, but this Cape Town City Improvement District does have, you know, um, people stationed every couple of
Yeah,
blocks to
they
make
definitely
sure that,
got eyes on the problem. But
yeah,
I really like that idea of the parking structure, because I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, Amsterdam has a similar kind of setup. Is that they have this big parking center, everyone can park there, and then they've got good like transit system from that parking center to within the city, and that's good. But then it relies on having good like public infrastructure, and then again, it's also like who's going to pay for that, and I think also it came to my mind as you were saying it. But I think the thing is like the waterfront is a little bit different because it is built as a tourist
it's
spot.
private. Yeah.
It's private done well because they want tourists, but like an accounting firm or like a bank or some of these bigger institutions, I mean they kind of catering to people with cars who come from the suburbs, right?
Sort of. So that's why I prefaced it with the whole, it may be in the municipal government's financial best interest, because again, we are a tourist-centric city, right?
Mm,
And by making that touristy area, or that area, entertainment area, a lovely place to be, it will mean that more people spend time in these restaurants and cafes, and spending money inside of our city is essentially what makes our city,
mm,
uh, more wealthy and gives us more money to do
mm,
more improvements. I mean, like every time someone buys a coffee, there's 15% VAT on that, right?
mm.
So if we can get like every tourist to buy one more coffee, right? Maybe that should just be the slogan, one more coffee for
One
every
more
tourist.
coffee. But one of the things that I would really like to see is a lot more plazas and a lot more
Mm,
like dining outside. I've kind of noticed it a little bit. In Cape Town, in the city, there's very few places that you can sit outside, or maybe you're sitting like you know maybe you're sitting just you know on a balcony, but you're not really sitting outside on like a plaza or something. And I think
and
there's
and if
Mozart on
those,
Church, which is one of them,
yeah,
um, and there's a few others that are quite nice to sit in. But that's like such a nice place because you get people walking past, right?
yeah,
You've got that probability that you'll bump into someone that you know. You'll see other people. Maybe you'll see the same regulars who are at that same place. You get this kind of sense of like everyone's there, and I do get
hmm
that from Cape Town. Actually, there's a couple of characters. I've never met these people, but like I see them everywhere. Like I see them, like that guy's always on the corner of at the Power and Glory. There's like a couple of people, and every time I drive past there,
hmm
that guy is there sitting having a beer at the Power and Glory, and it's just like part of like there's actual people that are living in the city.
And if you think about it, if we cordoned off Cliff Street all the way down to the bottom of Long Street, right? It means that all of those restaurants and bars and stuff would be able to put outside tables outside the front of their bars on where the street was, right?
Exactly.
So we would essentially create that outdoor dining experience, that outdoor socializing experience, that you would walk past there, and I would see you, having a beer, and I'd be like, "Oh, hey, Jason, what you doing?" Just kind of like what I was talking about in the park in Salida, right? And you're like, "Oh, you know,
Exactly.
I just came here after work and had a beer. Would you like to have a beer with me?" And I would be like, "Yes, thank you. I would like that very much." And then I would sit down and have a beer with you.
Yeah, exactly. So you're increasing the probability of social interactions, and I think that's like really key to it. Because the more people you interact with, I think the more you get a sense of happiness, and you get a more contentness. Um, and that's really, I think, what's like critical to having like a really good place to live in.
Mm.
And
I think again, I'm not a big fan of the word happiness, because happiness is super ephemeral, and even just the act of like questioning whether you are happy doesn't necessarily like makes you unhappy. Is, I think, contentness is a good one, or um, closeness, connectedness, like an
mm,
interconnectedness of a city, like how a forest uh, is a healthy forest if it is biodiverse.
mm,
I like I like to think the same thing of a city. Is the more biodiverse a city is, the more eclectic and the more moving parts, the more interconnected it is, the better the city. And unfortunately, we do also see like extraordinarily modern cities like Dubai, where they had the ability they had a lot of money very, very quickly. And they're like, okay, we're going to plan out this city. And so they said, okay, here's the financial district. Here's Internet City, where like all the tech companies are. Here is the shopping district. Here is this district. And that's actually a very unideal way to live. Is that like, oh, like, ideally you want to be able to walk from your house to a grocery store, right? Maybe grab coffee along the way.
Mm.
Maybe bump into your next door neighbor. But in Dubai, it's like there's none of that. You're in a apartment structure. You go down to the bottom, and if you don't have a car, you hop on the train that just runs to the specific part of town that you would want to be in, and then you go and you do that over there. Whereas like an organically grown city with a couple of stiff regulations around specifically motor vehicles, I think would be a lovely place to live.
I 100% agree. I think it's just nice to uh, have people around, and I've also been reading a lot about like startup communities, and that plays into that. One of the pillars of a good startup city is that sense of place, and also having access to those impromptu interactions, because you never know who you're going to meet at an event, and that might spark a conversation, and that might spark an idea, and then suddenly you're building a company or a startup, or
Mm.
I'm sure in Boulder you'll read a lot about it, because I think Boulder I'm reading a book called Startup Communities, and Boulder is one of those idealistic places that made it to be kind of a startup city.
Boulder has been rated as the best city to live in the United States,
That's amazing. No wonder you're
and I
staying
can
there
I
so
can see
long.
why. Well, so with Boulder is that it's actually so they have a lot of walk only streets, but they were explicitly designed as walk only. Is they
Yeah.
weren't driving streets that were then cordoned off. Is no, it's more like paved. It's kind of like Green Market Square in Cape Town. It's paved with tree cover, and restaurants sprawl out onto the pavement, and it's quite lovely.
Yeah. I think the thing is like it's just getting to that stage. Like if your city's already gone down a path, like I noticed in London, there's like like I was in the Hackney area, and there was this thing where people were starting to put up big planters. They're like, okay,
Mm,
well, this road we're going to put planters so you can't drive through there. It's no longer a drive through way. But then obviously, like I don't know if it's British culture or like pessimism or not in my backyard or NIMBYism. Is like there was people obviously in uproar that they're blocking that road, and I think they a couple of weeks later they went and removed those planters, which for me is like it's kind of there is going to be some resistance to getting to that point. People love their cars. People have spent money on their cars. They have a
hmm.
particular way of working, but it kind of is about like getting to that final stage. And I think the future really is. I mean, you're either going to live in a really big city, or you're going to live in the middle of the woods, and you're going to be self-sufficient, right? You're going to
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
get along with the people around you, or else you're not going to have a very enjoyable time.
So to kind of close off
Mm.
this podcast, I would like to give a big shout out to a organization in Cape Town, which people should definitely go and check out and contribute to. It's called Open Streets, and they are essentially at the forefront of trying to push legislation to create more cycle infrastructure, cordon off specific streets specifically for human. They also hold a couple of open streets festivals every year where the entirety of like Bree Street will be cordoned off for 2 days or a day, and there will just be like restaurants and performances and like sun-kissed salsa on the street. So
And
definitely go and take a look at that.
rollerblading and cycling
Rollerblading,
and
skateboarding.
scootering, and you can go down
Yeah,
that road and not have to worry about getting knocked down by some guy in a big truck. And that's something
yeah,
we can all look forward to, right?
that is something we can all look forward to.